So I'm here today to introduce JamesPaulGee and his work and his impact on the field of literacy. And so to introduce him, I kind of want to take some time and go through a little bit of my journey learning about him, because I think that kind of begins to show a lot about who he is in the field. And so I'll be perfectly honest. I kind of started with, why is this someone I'm interested in a lot of ways off of name recognition. Unfortunately, as a secondary science teacher, a lot of my formal training has not included much in the field of literacy. And pretty unfairly, I think there's kind of this perception that literacy is just reading and it's just for elementary teachers. And I'm objectively realize that that's not a fair perception. But there is kind of this lack of familiarity for a lot of secondary teachers. And so for me, if I recognize his name, it either meant that he was really influential or that his work was pretty far-reaching as far as its impact. And so I wanted to share this quote where he said, "The best way to get people not to open a door behind which you have hidden something evil is not just to lock it. Locks can be picked and they encourage people to try to get in, but to convince people it's not their job to open it. I was just doing my job and it's not my job are often twin and entangled evils." And so this quote actually comes from his personal website, and it's actually part of his blog that he kind of describes as just his own musings and his way to kind of work through some ideas. And I think that very small quote, just in and of itself, kind of shows the approach he takes to the field of education. In fact, this is that blog, and just as you begin to get familiar with who he is, it becomes pretty obvious that he takes his work very seriously, but he doesn't always take himself super seriously, and is pretty open to kind of branching out into some non-traditional areas and some atypical thoughts. And so, in fact, it just kind of amused me that one of his scrolling pictures here are a couple sheep. Just kind of that casualness that he brings to his work. In fact, on this website, if you notice up there, under the contact, it has a typical contact, email link. Like websites does. This actually takes him to his personal Facebook page, and where some researchers and some academics seem to really kind of distance themselves and put layers in between the general public and themselves. He goes ahead and puts a link directly to his personal Facebook page. It's not a fan page or anything like that. It's where you can go and you can add him as a friend if you'd like. And so when I started kind of down this path of who is he and what's he done in his career, as a practicing researcher, his CV is available through the Arizona State site where he currently works. And something I just could not get past was, if you notice down here in the corner, that's actually a 44-page CV. In fact, just kind of out of my own curiosity, I looked at this. His CV has just over 14,000 words, which puts it just a few thousand words short of Macbeth. So to say that he's done a lot in his career is obviously quite a bit of an understatement. And so one of the things that's kind of unique about him is that he is a linguist by training. And so what intrigues me is, how does a linguist approach literacy? And so this quote actually comes from out of his book, Discourse Analysis, and where it says that many people, including many linguists, think that the primary purpose of human language is to communicate information. In fact, I believe that is simply a prejudice on the part of academics who believe, often falsely, that what they themselves primarily do to and with each other is exchange information. If I had to single out a primary function of human language, it would be not one, but the following two: to scaffold the performance of social activities and to scaffold human affiliation within cultures and social groups and institutions. And so his work really branches out of a lot of what maybe for a lot of people seems like the traditional role of literacy and the traditional questions of literacy, because he starts by questioning a lot of assumptions, and even the simple assumption of what is the purpose of language. And a lot of times you wouldn't get questioned on assuming that language is about communicating information, but he looks at that and goes, well, but not really. And from that, he's developed a lot of his work. And so one of his big ideas is discourse analysis. And so discourse analysis comes out of this questioning what is language. And so in it, what he's saying is that language is used within a culture, and is used within a cultural context. And considering that it's something used within a context, we can, as researchers, look at how it is used within that context. And so it's kind of an interesting book because it doesn't just develop a theory, but it actually develops a theory in connection with the methodology. And so it's not just about here's a theoretical way of viewing language, but it's actually here's a theoretical way of thinking about language, and in this lens, here's a way of analyzing interviews or any sort of linguistic data that we get. So he has a very applicable view of his research, and so it is very theoretical, and he has training in theoretical languages, but that theory all connects right into a direct use as a researcher. Although his discourse analysis by itself would be a career's worth of influence and a career's worth of value added to the field, what he's probably best known for now is his thoughts on what video games and what their role is in education. In fact, if you just Google his name, the word game or video games pops up many times just in the first few results. And so this is kind of what he's become synonymous with as of late. And so what I think is interesting in that is how does someone with his background look at video games? And so the story actually starts out of, he started playing video games because he saw his son playing a video game. He just kind of wanted to understand how it works. And so he says, as I confronted the game, I was amazed. It was hard, long, and complex. I failed many times and had to engage in virtual research projects via the internet to learn some of the things that I needed to know. All of my baby boomer ways of learning and thinking did not work. And I felt myself using learning muscles that had not had this much of a workout since my graduate school days in theoretical linguistics. As I struggled, I thought, lots of young people pay lots of money to engage in an activity that is hard, long, and complex. As an educator, I realized that this was just the problem our schools faced. How do you get someone to learn something long, hard, and complex, and yet still enjoy it? I became intrigued by the implications that good video games might have for learning in and out of schools. And so what he really started by looking at is, this is something that kids are doing that is difficult, and they're doing it voluntarily, and not even voluntarily, but they're actually a lot of times paying for it or convincing their parents to pay for it. And so if kids are doing something that's this difficult and involves this much learning voluntarily, what are the implications for schools? And that's where he started with the idea of video games. And summarizing his career into just a few minutes is essentially impossible. And so when I started looking into him, I wanted to look at what are the takeaways I can use as a researcher, or I can use as a teacher, to learn from what he's done. And one of the things that I think is really important is the idea that language use is not a dichotomy of effective or ineffective, literate or illiterate, correct, incorrect. And I think we have that sort of thing. I mean, we, as a teacher, I check papers for grammar and things like that, and and it's either correct or it's not. And his point is that language is used within the context of a culture, and that grays the area of correct or incorrect. And I think that's kind of an important mentality shift to start to think of language as being used within a context. And that gives you the opportunity to look at the context and look at the language use and consider, why was it used in that way within this context? Another thing, I think, obviously he's pushed for that video games could be effective in education, and I think that's very useful. And I think we see places that they're beginning to be used, or elements from games are beginning to be used, and that's wonderful. But I think one of the takeaways are is that places where students are voluntarily learning difficult tasks can be models for formal education. And so he found this in video games, but for me as a researcher, it makes me go, well, what are other areas that kids are voluntarily learning to do difficult things, and whether we consider them academic or not, but where are they voluntarily learning to do things? and how can we use that as a model in formal education. And then I think the biggest thing that underlies a lot of his work is that prejudice and assumptions can keep researchers from asking the truly worthwhile questions. He starts his discourse analysis work with, well, what's language actually used for, and what's our bias in how we say language is used, and how is it really used, and how does that real use let us ask important research questions. He started with that by questioning the assumption that video games aren't educational. He looked and said, no, it actually is educational, and it's actually educational for a very difficult task. And if we look at it that way, how can we use elements of this in schools to better engage students? And I think it's that going back to the fundamental assumptions and questioning those that's let him have such diverse impact. I think that's why his work has been so wide-reaching. And this small quote, even though it's just a little note on his personal blog, I think there's a lot of power in that idea of what are the doors that in education that we're told we aren't supposed to look behind. What are the assumptions we're told we aren't supposed to question, and what happened if we did? And I think in that there's a world of opportunity, both in teaching and in research. And so for that, I'm very grateful for the work that JamesPaulGee has done. And I think that his work can be an incredible model for anyone in education.